Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so glad that I was able to tune in for the last little bit of the worship before getting started. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a bit of interaction here. And then at the end, I'm going to give you a chance to post your questions on Poll Everywhere. So we're not using the chat box for questions on this presentation. Although if you see somebody put a question there, you could help them by moving it to Poll Everywhere. So let me just share my screen with you first of all here, just 1 minute. Okay. There we go. And then go into full screen mode. I want to talk, since this is the first in 3 lectures, I want to talk about what's the first step to tackling climate change. But before I do that, if you are already on your computer, this is perfect. I want you to go ahead and open up a browser window, or if you don't want to do it on your computer, you can do it on your phone. Go ahead and go to pollev.com/Katharine. Now, this is a bit of a test because Bishop Jeffrey Shorey and I both spell our name the same way, and it's a little unusual. You have to have both A's in there to get it right. So make sure that you go to pollev.com/Katharine with 2 A's in it. And when you do, you are going to see the first question, which is a map. I want you to go ahead and click. If you're on your phone, you can do it with your finger. If you're on your computer, you have to use your mouse. I want you to go ahead and click where you are joining us from today. And it looks like Arizona was the, oh, now we got a few more people joining. California, okay, Oregon, Washington State, good. Another Arizona, excellent. Looks like we got a Wyoming there.
I saw Mississippi for a minute.
Oh, maybe that was just somebody's finger slipping. Okay, we have as far west as Minnesota. All right. Oh, we got somebody all the way over from New Jersey. Excellent. I haven't done this myself. I'm in Texas right now. Okay. Lots in Arizona, lots in California, and then kind of scattered throughout the rest. So now you kind of get the hang of the way this works. Now I want to ask you a question that's a little bit more difficult. You're going to have to answer this next question with a word. If you had to describe your church in 1 word, what word would you use? Now, if you have to cheat and use 2 words, make sure you join them with a dot because this is going to be a wordle. So 1 word, if you have to use 2 words, go ahead and join them with a dot. Perfect. I see people are getting the hang of it here. All right. And the bigger the word, the more people said that word. So it looks like welcoming and engaged are the top words, which is excellent. And then community, which is awesome. Compassionate, creative, yes. Progressive, kind, that's nice. Hopeful, searching, yes. Overwhelmed, I hear you, yes. Especially in these coronavirus days. I don't know if you know, but my husband is a pastor of a church and he just did his first COVID funeral last week locally, which was really sad. Welcoming, oh, I love that. Musical, missional, urban, Struggling, yes. Safe, that's a good one. Broad, excellent. Diverse, healthy, growing. Okay. All right, so now you know how this goes. And as we go along, I'll ask you the odd question just to make sure you're paying attention. And also because I want to know what you're thinking. And then at the end, you're going to be able to enter your questions to me the same way. Okay, here we go. When we talk about the 1 step to address climate change, our mind often jumps to one of these things, doesn't it? Changing the light bulbs, putting it in a smart thermostat, recycling. And of course, I do all of these things. Not only that, but a lot of us are taking small actions. A survey just this past year showed that 32% of us across the US have rewarded companies who we think are doing the right thing. 27% of us have punished companies that we don't think are doing the right thing by not buying their products. Only 4% of us say that we're vegetarian or vegan, but the vast majority of us are willing, 94% of us are willing to eat more fruits and vegetables, and it's good for us as well as being more affordable, as well as reducing our carbon footprint. So individual actions are important and many people are willing to do them. But here's the thing, even replacing all of our light bulbs with LEDs, although it's very important, it's only a tiny fraction of the problem. And in the United States, if every person in the whole United States did everything they could individually to cut their individual carbon footprint, that wouldn't be enough to get us even halfway to the Paris target. Not even halfway. As my colleague, fellow climate scientist Michael Mann said in an essay he wrote last year, he said, it's not banning cars, it's about electrifying them with clean energy. It's not about banning all meat, it's about having climate-friendly beef and substitutes also too. And a single scientist or even hundreds of scientists choosing never to fly again is not going to change the whole system by itself. True solutions require policy change. Like what? Like this, like the Paris Agreement. So 5 years ago, the world went to Paris. Bishop Mark was there from the Episcopal Church of California. Many faith leaders were there from all over the world. I met with many of them, and we had an interfaith service in Notre Dame, which was probably the highlight of my week. But when we look at where we are today, and this is something called the Climate Action Tracker, that's what CAT stands for. When we look at where we are today, we've already seen 1 full degree Celsius of warming, which is 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Already seen a full degree Celsius of warming, and we want to keep warming in this yellow to green area, but our current policies are likely to end us up at least 3 degrees, so that's between the orange and the red, if not well into the red. And if you look by country, dividing out commitments to the Paris Agreement by country, you can see that very few countries have made commitments that would fall into the green area on the thermometer. A few more have made commitments that would fall into the yellow area, but which list is the United States on? Whoopsie, it's on the critically insufficient list, the gray one, which means going back to the thermometer, if everybody did what the US did, we would be on the gray area. So when we look at this, we say, well, what are we supposed to do about this? Maybe, and this is the #1 solution that the most people suggest to me almost every week, maybe it's just that people don't understand the science enough. So if we could just explain the science more clearly, if you could explain the science, Katharine, maybe people would actually get it. And let's be clear. We have a lot of science that we could explain. We can talk about how global temperature is increasing faster than any time in the history of human civilization on this planet. We can talk about how Arctic ice is melting and glaciers are retreating and plants are blooming earlier in the year and ticks are spreading northward as our winters warm. We can talk about how all around the world, when we look in our own backyards, there are over 26,500 independent lines of evidence of animals and insects and plants and sea level and glaciers telling us that yes, the planet absolutely is warming. And as scientists, we've looked at why this is happening. We know that climate has changed in the past due to natural factors like the sun and natural cycles and volcanoes. We know that because we're the ones who study it. But we also know that if the planet were being controlled by the sun right now, we'd be getting cooler, not warmer. The sun's energy has been going down the last 40, 50 years, not up. We know that it can't just be a natural cycle causing the planet to warm, because all natural cycles do is they just move heat around the climate system from east to west or north to south or ocean to atmosphere and back again. But today, the whole planet, north, south, east, west, ocean, atmosphere, the whole thing is warming. We also know that it can't just be the ice age cycles. I don't know if you're familiar with the Ice Age movie, but if you have children or grandchildren, you probably are. We know it isn't just the Ice Age cycles because according to the Ice Age cycles, in the next 1,500 years or so, we would be heading into another ice age. Instead, we're going faster and faster in the opposite direction. And we know that it can't be volcanoes causing us to warm right now because volcanic eruptions actually cool the earth down. And although they do produce a little bit of heat trapping gases, it's the equivalent. All the geologic activity around the whole world produces the same amount of carbon and methane, heat trapping gases, as a few mid-sized states. That's it. No, we know that it really is us. And if you want more about this science, our Global Weirding series on YouTube has all of this science. So if you want more on that, go to Global Weirding. But we know that our planet has a natural blanket of heat trapping gases. That's the way our planet was made. The sun shines down and goes through this blanket, kind of like a window, but then the earth heats up and gives off heat energy. And just like a blanket keeps you warm at night, the Earth's blanket traps the heat in the Earth system, keeping us over 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than we would be otherwise. The natural blanket is why we have life on Earth. So if it's natural, what's the problem? The problem is that we are digging up and burning fossil fuels that are producing more and more heat trapping gases that are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet that it doesn't need. And just like you would, if someone snuck into your room at night and put an extra blanket on you, you would wake up sweating, saying, I didn't need this extra blanket. In the same way, the Earth is running a temperature because of the extra blanket that we have put around it. The science of understanding what's happening to our planet can be incredibly complex, but the basics are simple. And these facts have been communicated. They have been communicated, I went to Google, by 2.6 million scientific studies. 2.6 million. Isn't that an insane number? That's how many scientific studies we've had about it. We have had 6 IPCC assessments, and they're working on the 6th assessment right now. We have had 4 national climate assessments. I was a lead author on number 2, number 3, and number 4, which was so big it was published as 2 volumes. The first volume, 500 pages. The second volume was 1,600 pages. Thousands of scientists around the world have written letters. This is a letter written by 11,000 scientists published last January. And this isn't just something new. We've been doing this for a very long time. We have known that digging up and burning coal at that time, and then later, obviously, oil and natural gas, we've known that digging up and burning coal was wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, causing it to get warmer since the work of John Tyndall and Eunice Foote in the 1850s. So no, more science is not the answer, because in 2020, here we are. What are we looking at here? We are looking at a survey from this past February that asked people what they thought of various issues: Social Security, the economy, the budget deficit, terrorism, race, military, immigration, climate change, and environmental protection. And then they looked at how people who said they were Republican differ from how people who say they're Democrat. The wider the gray bar, the further apart people are on an issue depending on their political affiliation. So if they're close together, it means that you think pretty much the same thing, no matter if you're Democrat or Republican. If you're really far apart, it means that this issue is very politically polarized. And what issue do we have at the very top of this? We have climate change. And number 2, we have environmental protection. So 150 years of studying and communicating the facts on climate change have not moved the dial at all in a positive direction. In fact, if anything, it's like it's moved it in the wrong direction. When the Yale program on climate communication surveyed people around the country by county, and this is a fantastic set of maps, they've asked about 30 different questions, and you can click on your county and you can click on your congressional district, not on my slides. You have to go to their website. But you can, on their website, if you Google Yale climate opinion maps, and actually if somebody who's good with their fingers, if you don't mind Googling that and putting the link in the chat, that would be awesome. Just Google Yale climate opinion maps and put the link in the chat so people can get it. You can click on your county or your congressional district and it will show you how people respond to their 30 questions in your region. Asking people, do you think global warming is mostly caused by human activities? This is what the map looks like. Large areas of the country are blue, which means that less than 50% of people said yes. And when we divide that same question out by political affiliation, this is what it looks like. Climate change is now the most politically polarized issue in the entire country. The best predictor of whether we agree with the simple fact that climate is changing and humans are responsible is not how much science we know, it's simply where we fall in the political spectrum. So at this point, we have a huge question mark in our head. The first question mark is, why aren't we meeting the Paris targets? The second question is, why didn't providing more scientific information on how bad it is convince people that this was serious? To answer this question, we have to turn to a very different type of science, neuroscience. And when we do, it is fascinating. So Tali Sharot is a neuroscientist, and she studies how our brains process information. She's written a fantastic book called The Influential Mind, which the person who's quick with their fingers, you could Google The Influential Mind and put a link there if people are interested. It's an excellent book. It's not hard to read at all. But I'm going to distill the nuggets here for you that are relevant to climate change. She says our human brains are actually programmed to get a kick out of information. We love information. So that's why the whole online thing works. We love information. But if we are confronted with new information that we don't agree with, our brain just shuts off. We accept information we agree with. It's called confirmation bias. We accept something we agree with, but we reject it if we don't agree with it. And it gets worse. What she also found is that the more information available to us, and if wealth of information doesn't describe the internet, I don't know what does, the more information available to us, it makes us more resistant to change because it's so easy to just Google it and find something that says, yes, you're right and they're wrong. And then, this one's the kicker, she finds that as we're exposed to contradicting information and opinions, it actually increases our polarization. It doesn't decrease it, it increases it. So hammering people with information that they don't agree with causes their brain to shut off. It makes them more resistant the next time, and it can even make them even more polarized than they already were. So this actually explains how after 150 years of telling people the facts about climate science, we've ended up with climate science being the most politically polarized issue in the whole country. This is why. It's the way our brains work. Dan Kahan is a social scientist, not a neuroscientist, but he also studies the way people think. And he studies specifically the connection between education and intelligence and understanding climate change. He finds that people who understand the most science aren't the most concerned about climate change. The more they know, the more polarized they are. And in fact, he conducted an experiment, which was really shocking. He developed something called ordinary science intelligence. It's just like an IQ test for how good people are at science. So he developed this IQ test for science. And then he said, is climate changing due to human activities? That's the question he asked. And he found that smarter people had a bit of a greater chance of answering yes, but not. So the line goes up a little bit, but not a lot. Then he took this group of people, same group of people, and he divided them into two groups. And now you can probably guess. How did he divide them into two groups? Did he do male and female? No. Did he do young and old? No. Did he do educated and not educated? No. He divided them into two groups based on one thing: politics. And here's what he found. The smarter we are, the better we are at cherry picking the information that proves that we're right. So in other words, the smarter we are, the better we are to argue with the devil, so to speak. We're better at justifying what we already believe if we think it conflicts with who we are than at changing our minds the smarter we are. So how does this play into the way we talk about climate change with people that we know? Well, climate's changing and we see bad things happening and we get worried. So what do? We share more scary data with people because we figured if they don't get how bad it is, if I just tell them how Greenland is melting 6 times faster than it was 20 years ago, or how, 40% of the rain that fell during Harvey was because of climate change, because California is burning down today, because climate change is making wildfires worse. If I just tell them this, surely they will get it, right? But neuroscience says, no. The more scary data we share that conflicts with what people already disagree with or already think, the more people reject it. Inaction results, not action, inaction. And Tally goes on to explain, she says, fear and anxiety cause us to withdraw or to freeze or to give up, not to take action. And so climate just changes more. It's a vicious cycle that we've been stuck in for decades. How do we break the cycle? This is the most important thing that we can do when it comes to climate change. Not recycling, not changing light bulbs, not smart thermostats, not eating lower down the food chain. All of those are important, don't get me wrong. I do those, I have solar panels, I drive a plug-in car, but the single most important thing we can do, every single one of us, is figure out how to break this vicious cycle. And we break it by sharing the right type of information. What is the right type of information? If it isn't the science, if it isn't how much Greenland is melting or how fast global temperature is rising, what is it? Well, here's where the social science can help us again. It turns out that our real problems are that we don't think climate change matters to us, and we don't think there's anything positive we can do to fix it. So we think that climate change is a psychologically distant issue. It happens over here, future, not to me and not now. And then we don't think there's anything we can do to fix it. People say, oh, well, to fix it, you have to destroy the economy. You have to let the United Nations take over the world. You have to abort all the babies. I have, in all seriousness, had multiple people say that to me, that that's the only solution to climate change. And so that's why they can't support climate solutions. The real problems are not science education. They're not intelligence. They're not people not getting the science. It's that we don't think it matters and we don't think we can fix it. And here's the data to prove it. So remember the Yale climate opinion maps. And remember I said they ask about 30 different questions. Here's a set of different questions they ask that show us why this matters. First of all, they said, is global warming happening? And it turns out most people say yes. The vast majority of counties are orange. That means yes. And the darker orange, the more people say yes. Then they said, do you think it will harm plants and animals? Yes. Do you think it will harm future generations? Yes. Do you think it will harm people in people in the United States? All of a sudden we see a lot more blue, right? So we went from yes, it will harm plants and animals and future generations, developing countries, they asked that too. Will it harm people in the US? We get a lot more blue. And then they asked the kicker question. Do you think it will harm you? Blue, dark blue, except for a few places that have Hispanic Catholics and Native Americans, because those two people groups are very concerned about climate change. Hispanic Catholics and Native Americans. Also, I think the area that is currently being burned by wildfires in California, that is also yellow or orange there. We don't think it matters to us personally. Why not? Because the number one image people associate with climate change is an animal that we haven't seen in person, a polar bear. Or if we imagine people being affected by climate change, I was just reading recently about a scientific study that looked at the pictures or photographs that news articles use to accompany climate change stories. They said the number one type of image didn't have people in it, but they said the number two type of image that did have people in it, it had people from countries far away who looked as if they were just going about their daily life here walking down the street, but they were being affected by climate change. It wasn't showing people where we live whose lives are being devastated by climate change as they are. So we think it doesn't matter to us. We think it's distant in space. We think it's distant in time. And we think it's distant in terms of it matters to people who are environmentalists or tree huggers, but if I'm not one of those people, then it doesn't matter to me. It's distant in terms of relevance. This was not the bluest map, though. There's one more that's bluer. So again, this is the same map. Do you think it matters to you? And people said no. And then they asked one more question. They said, do you ever talk about it? No. So if you don't talk about it, why would you care? And if you don't care, why would you ever act? So that's why I am absolutely convinced that the first thing that every single one of us can do about this issue is talk about it by sharing the information that really makes a difference. And that information is why and how climate change matters to us, not the polar bear, not future generations, us, here and now. Why and how climate change matters to us and what we truly can do to fix it. So what we do matters because we can talk to people about how we compost or recycle or eat less meat or put solar panels on the house or want to put solar panels on the church or changed our light bulbs or reduced our flying in our travel. We can talk to people about these things, but talking about them is the most important thing. And if you think it's not important, let me just tell you a story. So about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a young teenager who was really worried, and not just worried, but anxious, and not just anxious, but depressed about climate change. So she convinced her family to stop eating meat and to stop flying and to reduce their carbon footprint. And they did everything they could to live a low lifestyle. And if she had stopped there, no one would know who I was talking about. But today, I would venture to guess that just about everybody on this call knows who I'm talking about because she did one more thing. She took a piece of cardboard, she painted a few words on that piece of cardboard, and she went and she sat outside a building with that piece of cardboard. She used her voice to say one thing. And what was that one thing? School strike for climate. Her name? Greta. Using our voice is the most effective thing that anybody can do, even if that voice consists of 4 words on a piece of cardboard. So let me dig a little bit further into this so you see what I'm talking about. I'm going to give you lots of examples here, and then again, I will be taking your questions at the end, so don't worry, we will get to questions. But I want to explain, how do we do this? How do we talk about how it matters to us and what we can really do to fix it? Let's go. So we scientists could say sea level is rising, and we could show a figure with different colors on it. How does this connect to people personally? This figure does not connect to people personally. But if we talk about how our community is seeing saltwater flooding, or the community where people I know live, we can talk about how Miami is raising the level of their streets by 2 feet to offset flooding. We can talk about how our property values have dropped by billions of dollars. We could talk about how people who buy coastal homes are going to be losing their investments. This brings it home to where we live. Instead of talking about colored lines on a chart, we're talking about people's lives, people's homes, people's businesses, people's bank accounts. And extending this globally, we've got 700 million people who live in this low elevation coastal zone. So the chances of you knowing one or more of those people, I would say, is quite high, or being one yourself. Then people could say, well, the oceans are warming. And this is even more abstract. So the oceans are warming, good or bad? I don't even know. But when we talk about how the coral is being bleached, how the Great Barrier Reef is dying, toxic algae are on the rise from a warming ocean, how a warming ocean actually makes our hurricanes stronger, how due to a warming ocean, our hurricanes are ratcheting up faster from a tropical storm to a category 1, 2, 3, 4, or even 5. Because of a warmer ocean, they're getting bigger because a warmer ocean feeds hurricanes, giving them more energy. They're getting stronger and they have a lot more rainfall associated with them. In fact, Hurricane Harvey, as I alluded to, had up to 40% more rain because of human-induced climate change, and it's estimated that its economic damages were 4 times higher because of climate change. It was a real event that happened to real people living in a real city, who I know many people from that city, and you probably do too. This is how warmer oceans affect us. And talking about this is the way that we bring it home, not talking about kind of the abstract concept. What about temperature increasing? And I'm actually showing you here, if you don't know, I'm showing you figures from the National Climate Assessment, and then I'm showing you the headlines of how it really matters to us. So we could say temperature is increasing. It's increased 1 degree Celsius. And people say 1 degree Celsius, that sounds like nothing. Well, that 1 degree Celsius is enough to what? To break, not just break, but smash heat wave records, to increase heat-related deaths, to put many of the poorest people at risk. And as the planet gets warmer, we actually see that warmer air holds more water. So when a storm comes along, there's a lot more water vapor there for the storm to sweep up and dump on us because the air is warmer. So we're seeing more heavy precipitation across almost every part of the country, especially in the Midwest and the North. We're seeing more heavy precipitation, more floods, and more damages. Warmer temperature, I think somebody needs to mute there. I hear phones sort of beeping in the background. Warmer temperatures are also increasing the risk of wildfires. Wildfires happen due to human ignition and due to lightning. They had a horrible dry lightning storm just a couple of days ago in California, and they have wildfires burning out of control now because it's so hot and so dry that when a fire starts, it's really hard to stop it. It's not just in California. It happens in Alaska. It happens in Canada. And I know it's hard to think all the way back to January 2020. January 2020 at this point seems like 10 years ago, doesn't it? But in January 2020, what were the headlines about? They were about Australia. They were experiencing fires, the likes of which we scientists did not expect to happen for another 20 to 30 years. This is really bringing it home. We know that wherever we live, we are already at risk from floods, droughts, wildfires, storms, hurricanes, and more. And Texas is the most at risk because of its location. We get everything. We get ice storms. Yes, we get blizzards. We get hurricanes. We get floods. We get droughts. We get heat waves. We get thunderstorms. We get tornadoes. We get everything. We know that we're already naturally at risk. So we always have a chance of rolling a double six naturally. But as the planet gets warmer, it's sneaking in and taking another and then another of those numbers and turning them into sixes too, and even taking another number and turning it into a 7. So we're rolling more and more 6s and 7s as the planet warms right here where we live. The question is not, did climate change cause an event? The question is, did climate change make it worse? And increasingly, our answer as scientists is yes, and we can tell you how much worse. Wildfires are a natural part of life across the West. Without climate change, wildfires would have burned 11 million acres since the 1980s, without climate change. With climate change, as of 2015, wildfires had already burned 24 million acres, and now, of course, that number is off the top of the chart. So climate change has doubled the area burned by wildfires. We also know that climate change is making heat waves stronger or more likely. We know that it's making our hurricanes more damaging. We know that climate change is affecting us everywhere we live, and it is affecting everything we care about. It is affecting our water, our food, our security, our economy, our health. It's affecting everything we care about as humans. In fact, my favorite word for climate change is a threat multiplier. My favorite phrase, I should say. It's a phrase that comes from the military. We care about climate change because it takes what we already care about, what we're already concerned about, and it makes it worse. So in that sense, to care about climate change, we only have to be one thing, and living thing on this planet, and we are all that. As the Prime Minister of Dominica said, his island was one of the ones that was devastated during the 2017 hurricane season. He said, to deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have just lived. So what is he saying? He's saying it's not the future, it's already happened. And he's saying it's not far off, we already lived it here and now. So question for you, go back to pollev.com. Hopefully you still have that window open on your computer or your phone. And in one word, when it comes to climate change, what are you most concerned about? I don't expect to see just one answer here. I expect to see almost as many answers as there are people on this call, because we are all affected by climate change in different ways. And that's why having conversations about how we're affected is so important, because it matters to all of us. If I live in the Northeast, I'm not so concerned about drought. If I live in Washington State, I'm not so concerned about hurricanes. If I live in, North Carolina, you might think I'm not so concerned about wildfires, but they actually do have wildfires there too. We're concerned about it because of who we are. We're concerned about food, drought, people. We're concerned about our children and our grandchildren. We're concerned about our health. We're concerned about the health of the planet, which is the same thing, right? We're concerned about extremes, air pollution, about the poor who suffer the most. We have so many different reasons to care, and that's why it's so important to have these conversations, because we're all different. And by sharing why we care, we can actually start to connect on our pre-existing values. So you guys get it. You've already got it. That's step one. Why do you care? Why does it matter to you personally? And here's the interesting thing. This is one of my colleagues at my university, Chris. He says he found out. Now, remember I showed you that figure with the gray bars, how climate change was the most politically polarized issue in the country? He found out that our polarization decreases when we bring climate impacts home. So when we talk about things that are now and here, as opposed to future and far away, it actually decreases our polarization. Isn't that cool? It makes a difference. So rather than talking about polar bears, my favorite picture for climate change is us on an iceberg, metaphorically speaking. We are the ones on that iceberg. If there was a polar bear with us, the polar bear would have eaten us by now. So how do we then have these conversations? We have these conversations by bonding over shared values, connecting the dots so people understand why it matters, and then inspiring people to address solution aversion. So let's go through a few of these together, okay? Bonding, number one. What can we bond over? We can bond over the place we live without somebody else who lives there. We can bond over being a parent, having family, having grandchildren. We can bond over an organization we're part of, like the Rotary Club, an activity we enjoy like fishing or birding or skiing or dancing was the icon they had there. We can bond over a shared military experience. And most relevant to this call, we can bond over a shared faith. So how would you bond, for example, over a shared faith? Let me dig into that last one just a little bit further as an example. How would you do that? you would start with what you believe. And actually, and you start with who you are. So I want to ask you another question here. Who are you? I care about climate change because I am a what? What are you? Do you care because you are a parent or a grandparent? Oh, somebody actually said that while I was saying that. Do you care because you're a Christian or a human? Do you care because you're a scientist? Do you care because you're a gardener? Do you care because you're a birder? Do you care because you live in California or Oregon or Washington State? Why do you care? Oh, somebody said deacon. That's good. That's excellent. Do you care because you're a hiker? Yes. Or a gardener and a parent, a grandparent? Do you care because you're a Christian? Do you care because you're a human? Yes. We care because of who we are. And so this is how we can bond with other people. As a parent, I can bond with somebody over being a parent. As a Christian, we can bond with somebody over being a Christian. As a gardener, as a birder, as a caretaker, as a follower of Jesus, as a scientist, as somebody who lives in Washington State or California or Oregon or Minnesota, we can bond over somebody living in those places. We bond with someone over who we are and who they are. This is step number one. And as a Christian, often when I talk to other Christians, I say, well, as a Christian, we all know what God's greatest gift is. We're taught that in Sunday school, that God's greatest gift was his son. But have you ever stopped to think about what God's second greatest gift might be? The fact that maybe it's this planet that gives us our physical life? Because we were not designed to float around in outer space. We were designed to live on a planet that gives us air to breathe and water to drink and food to eat and all the materials we use for everything we need. Our planet also gives us the incredible beauty that surrounds us every day and feeds our souls. And in the Bible, it talks about how humans were made in God's image for a purpose. So that what? So that we could rada, is the Hebrew word, every living thing that moves on the face of the earth. Rada means dominion, but not domination. It means taking care of. In other places in the Bible, it talks about how God is a ruler who delivers the needy and the afflicted and they who have no helper, who has compassion on the poor and who saves the lives of those who in need. And Jesus even talks about it too. He says, the godless rule by power going to their heads. But with you, whoever wants to be great must be a servant. Whoever wants to be first must be the slave. That is what the Son of Man has done, come to serve, not to be served. So this is what we as Christians believe. This is who we are. It's not about viewing ourselves at the top of the pile. We don't believe that we're just one of every living thing with no differentiation. As Christians, we believe we actually have a responsibility. And I can't take credit for this. This comes from an Anglican theologian called Dave Bookless with the amazing organization called Arasha. We have a responsibility to care for and to love, not to stand on top of and to dominate, but to care for every living thing. And of course, we humans are living things too, right? And so we know that climate change is not fair. It deepens existing inequalities. It disproportionately affects women. It disproportionately affects Indigenous and marginalized communities. It disproportionately affects communities of color right here in the United States, maybe even in the city where you're living. Climate change is not fair, and it disproportionately affects the poor and the needy. We know that as climate changes, it's already increasing the gap between the rich and the poor by as much as 25% in some countries. And so as Christians, we know that caring about a changing climate is not somehow antithetical to who we are. Rather, it's entirely consistent with who we are and who God has made us. So this is how we can bond, just one example, how we can bond over a shared faith. How we're told to walk in love as we have been loved ourselves, or as they say in Texas, where they put the Bible on road signs, that love thy neighbor thing, I meant it, signed God. So bonding over shared values is so important. Then what's step two? Step two is showing how it matters to us as Christians, how it matters to us as parents, or grandparents, how it matters to us living in the place where we live, how it matters to us as humans. And I'm not going to talk too much about that because we already talked a lot about that, right? How it matters to us where we live, wildfires, floods, heat waves, power outages, sea level rise, hurricanes, storms, and more. And then the last final step is to talk about solutions. Like what? Industrial solutions that companies are doing. Really incredible. And these headlines are a bit old. I mean, look at the dates on these headlines. Talk about what's happening in our state. Yes, even Texas. We have the biggest army base in the US powered by clean energy. We have an airport that's 100% carbon neutral, which is pretty incredible. Not the flights themselves, but the airport. Talking about what's happening in faith communities. So many good stories about faith communities. Interfaith Power and Light has many more of these great stories. Talking about what's happening in surprising places, like a coal mine museum going solar, or the fact that an airline is using biofuel. Yes. About what's happening around the world, where places where people don't even have access to electricity are being transformed by clean energy. These stories really give us hope because they show us how individual people are acting. So individual actions do make a difference, but when we put them all together, that's how we get system-wide change. And how do we put together individual actions into system-wide change? We do it by talking, by communicating, by sharing these stories with each other. If you're looking for any more good stories to share, Project Drawdown is fantastic. They have all different topics that you can get into and learn more about incredible solutions. Some of them very old school, some of them very new school, some of them behavioral changes, some of them technological changes. So the very first step to talking about climate change really is talking about it. And does it matter? Yes. Here's my last scientific study for you by Matthew Goldberg, and he found that when we talk about climate change with friends and family, it leads people to learn influential facts. These facts about how it matters to us and what we can do to fix it cause us to talk about it even more. And it enters into a positive feedback loop. Like what? Like this. Climate changes, we get worried, but what do? We break the cycle. Instead of sharing more scary facts, what do? We talk about how climate change matters to us and positive solutions. That's what we do. People feel empowered rather than scared and helpless. Action results. And as Tali Sharot says, the human brain is built to associate forward action with reward rather than avoiding harm. So if we reframe, she wasn't even talking about climate change here, but it's so apropos. She says, if we reframe our message so the information we provide will induce hope, not dread, that is how we break the cycle. How incredible is that? So as Christians, we know that we truly can make a difference. We know that having conversations over shared values is something that we do all the time in our communities. But what I hope that I've showed you is that it can make a difference. Talking about it really can make a difference. So when I was asked to do a TED Talk about 1.5 years ago, I said, I want to do a TED Talk about the most important thing you can do about climate change. And they said, well, we've got TED Talks about changing light bulbs and electric cars and vegan diets. I said, no, that's not what I want to do a TED Talk on. I want to do a TED Talk on the most important thing that anybody can do about climate change, because I have become convinced that the single most important thing we can do is this: talk about, have a conversation about climate change. And not only that, but having that conversation gives us hope. As my colleague Renee Lertzman talks about here, our anxiety turns into hope when we act. So I have a couple more talks that I've given in the past, and this talk is none of those, where one with Bishop Jeffrey Shorey, who's your next speaker, we talk about hope. So I'm going to put the links to these talks in the chat if you're interested in more. Talk about hope, talk about how do we relate our faith with our science, and talk about our theology, our Christian theology in climate change. Those aren't the talks I gave you today, though, because I heard from you loud and clear that you wanted to know, what can we do? And the most important thing we can do is remind people that caring about God's creation, which includes people and other living things that are already affected by climate change today, it is a genuine expression of our faith. It is a faithful acceptance of our responsibility, and it is a true expression of God's love. In a nutshell, it is who we already are. And that's why it matters. Thank you. All right. Question time. Now, you can write a whole sentence here. It doesn't have to have any dots in it. Write a whole sentence. Just make sure it has a question mark at the end. And here's the fun thing. Not only can you ask a question, you can upvote the question that somebody else asked that you want me to answer. We won't have time to answer all the questions here. I'll answer the top questions. So go ahead and go to PolyV, type in your question if you have one. But if you don't have a question, go ahead and see what other questions people are posting, and then upvote the questions that you most want me to answer. All right? Go ahead and do that. And there we go. Oops, somebody was very quick there. The very first question, what gives you hope? So this is a really interesting question, because I noticed I was starting to get this question from almost every group I talked to in the US and Canada and Europe, young, old, faith-based, not faith-based. So what I did was I turned this question around and I asked over 700 people across Canada, the US, and North America and Europe. I asked them, what gives you hope? And I took the answers I got and I turned these answers into the talk. Let me just go back here for a second. Whoops. I turned the answers into this first talk that I did with Bishop Jeffrey Shorey. So if you want to know more about hope, I strongly recommend watching this talk that we did together just this past December in Washington, D.C. But in a nutshell, to answer your question, what gives you the most hope? There we go. It's seeing people and hearing about people acting. Individual people, organizations, groups, something where people are just saying something, or they're doing something, or they're making a change, or they're discovering something new. Hearing about what's already happening is huge. And in order to get that hope, I go out and I look for it, because it doesn't find us where we are. If you go to the CNN website, for example, or any news organization, just look at the headlines. Negative, 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 negative. Hope does not come and find us. We have to go out and look for it. But when we do, it is there. There are so many incredible, hopeful stories, and I tend to post them on social media. Stories like a group of sixth graders here in Lubbock, Texas, the second conservative city in the country, deciding to dedicate their science project to carbon farming, how we can put carbon back in the soil. And they ended up winning a national competition with that. That's a pretty hopeful story. And that's just one of millions of points of light out there, so to speak, about hope. How do we affect policy change at the government level? I tried to answer that with this presentation, but let me kind of go over it a little bit. We have to affect change at this level. How do we do it? By starting with ourselves. And how do we start with ourselves? By having these conversations. We can have them with people at our church. We can have them with our elected officials at the city level, and at the state level, and at the national level. Having these conversations with people in the place where we work, the organization or the business or the school or the institution where we work. By connecting the dots between why climate change matters, values we already have, and watch my TED Talk for more on this. By connecting the dots between the values we already have and how climate change matters, we can show people that who they already are is the perfect person to care. In fact, they already care, they just hadn't realized it. And by building those connections, that is how we work up to that policy change. We can't wait for everybody to change their minds. We just need a critical mass. And the way to get that critical mass is talking about it. Do I have a theological talking point guide that connects climate change to political initiatives? Not just one, because it matters what people believe. So Some Christians are extremely motivated by the idea of caring for the poor. Others are very motivated by the idea of being good stewards of the resources we've been given. Others are motivated by the idea of restoring or renewing and participating in God's regenerative work with creation. Other people who call themselves Christians are frankly not motivated by Christian values at all. Not at all. So what makes them tick? Figuring out what makes people tick. Is it the values of the Rotary Club? Is it economic values? Is it national security values? Is it the values of the place where they live? Figuring that out first is key. And that's why I can't tell you an argument that works with everybody, because there isn't. The first thing to do is what? What's the first step? Bond over shared values. If you don't know what their values are, you have to figure that out first. So listen and ask questions first. Then bond over a shared value, which can be something as simple as cooking or knitting, as well as shared theological values or the economy or jobs. Find out what it is, bond over shared values, show how climate change affects those values, and then bring up a positive, constructive solution that people can identify with. Climate change disproportionately affects the poor. How can we show that there are intersections we need to explore? Oh, yes. Climate change disproportionately affects people who are poor, people who are vulnerable, people who are marginalized. Climate change disproportionately affects people of color here in the United States as well as around the world. So if you care about justice, if you care about Black Lives Matter, if you care about Indigenous people, if you care about children, if you care about women, if you care about any of these issues, you already care about climate change, because the only reason we care about climate change is because of everything it affects. Let me be clear. If climate change were just causing a 2 or 3 degree increase in the average temperature of the planet, nothing else, who cares? The reason we care is because it affects everything we already care about. So that's why, again, figuring out what people already care about and then connecting the dots to climate change is so important. I don't think climate change needs to be at the top of our priority list. In fact, I don't think it should be on our priority list at all. We already have the things on our priority list that matter. All we have to do is show how climate change connects to those things. So we don't have to change who people are. We just have to show them who they already are is the perfect person to care. See the difference there? You're not changing who somebody is, you're showing them who they really are. And there's plenty of parallels in our faith about that, isn't it? All right. How do we break through our reticence to talk about the good things we in the church are doing? Do it. Good news is fantastic. You have to share the good news that you know. I mean, isn't that what we're called to do as Christians too, is share the good news? We are called to share the good news. So do it. Break through your reticence and absolutely start that conversation. And in times of coronavirus, well, I've given a bunch of talks, and I'll put a bunch of links to them here because I can see from your questions, you're asking questions that I've talked about in different talks, not this one. There are so many parallels between coronavirus and climate change. But the biggest parallel, I think, is this, and this is a good one to end on, that when it all comes down to it, when we are confronting a global worldwide threat, what matters to every single one of us is the same no matter what language we speak, what country we live in, or even what side of the political aisle we vote for. It's our health and our safety and that of our family and our friends and our communities. What matters to all of us when it really comes down to it. That's what the pandemic threatens. And that is exactly what climate change does too. Not only that, but we've seen some positive changes come out of the pandemic. We've seen blue skies. We've seen a return to nature and walking and cycling and spending more time with our families, as opposed to just, running in that frantic hamster wheel of life. We've seen how lifestyle changes can actually be good for us and can be positive and beneficial. So there's plenty of ways to start conversations. I love these questions. These are fantastic questions. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to post a bunch of resources here afterwards in the chat for you to dig into a little bit further. And I also want to take you to my website. This is the benefit of having your screen sharing right here. I want to show you on my website here, which is just my name. Hang on a second here. KatharineHayhoe.com is my website. And on my website, if you go to frequently asked questions, so FAQ right here, click on frequently asked questions, and you will see that I have a ton of questions people have asked me. I think I've got almost 20 questions here that I answer with more resources. So I've noticed in your Q&A, a lot of questions you've asked are actually here on my list. So go to the frequently asked questions, click on one of these, and there will be lots more resources and answers that address your questions. Thank you so much for having me. This has been absolutely fantastic.